Oh, Ralph, how I envy your optimism. There is no Springfield 50 years in the future. With global warming trapping the CO2 inside our poisonous atmosphere, our superheated oceans will rise, drowning our lowlands, leaving what's left of humanity baking in deserts that once fed the world. And in the new Nineveh, darkness falls.
I'm going to talk about climate change. Lisa Simpson is always right, or at least that is what we are supposed to believe, right? I'm going to talk about climate change as an existential threat first, and then I'm going to talk about what we really know about the impact of climate change, as well as the political economy of exaggeration in the media coverage of climate change. My name is Richard Toll. I am an environmental economist. You will meet me again in year 2, perhaps in year 3. I know that English is an evolving language. I know that the word literally, as used by young people, means something different than its actual meaning. We're now at university, so semantics is actually important, and words have meanings that you cannot just take and stretch and use it for something else. This girl here claims that she has literally died, which would imply that she looks quite good for a zombie, right? She is not literally dead. Let's hope that the video now works.
Teenagers are shitting themselves about what's happening for the future. They've got another 50, 60, 70 years to live on this planet. By that time, there could be only 1 billion people left. I mean, that's 6 billion people that have died from starvation or been slaughtered in war.
That's one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion, who thinks that lots of people will die because of climate change. He's certainly not alone. This is a placard you often see at demonstrations, climate protests. David Attenborough is a bit more optimistic. He doesn't think that lots of people will die. He simply thinks that civilization will collapse, which, if taken literally, means that we will become hunter-gatherers. He's not alone either. This is the head of the European Central Bank, who says that climate change will mean that we all be roasted, toasted, fried, and grilled. The Secretary General of the United Nations says that if we don't stop climate change, it will be suicide. The Vice Chancellor, in her email yesterday, wrote this, and there's 2 remarkable things. One is that there's 3 traditions in university. There's the Italian tradition, in which the student body, that is you guys, are the university. Then there is the French tradition, in which the faculty, us, are the university. And that French tradition is actually where Oxford and Cambridge have their roots. And then there's the modern English tradition, where you guys are unruly customers and we are just workers, right? And C is the university. So that is the first thing she said. But the second thing that she says is there's all these problems with the university and with higher education in general, but most of all, above all else, climate change is our biggest problem. I think it's quite a statement. As workers, we are not allowed to criticize management. So I'll just move on to the next. You may have seen this guy, Leonardo DiCaprio, who also thinks that climate is an existential threat. We will surely perish if we don't act. Bernie Sanders takes it a bit further. No, he does not. In This was part of the the successful campaign of Biden to win the presidency. Bernie argues that climate change is not an existential threat to humanity, but it's an existential threat to the planet. And there is indeed an academic paper out there that says that the Earth will explode because of climate change. For that, you have to make quite incredible assumptions about the geology and the chemical composition of the planet. This is Bill Nye, the science guy, talking about climate change. And the picture that he uses is a globe on fire. President Obama also thinks it's an existential threat to the planet, not just us. Greta, who you probably know, says that it's so serious that we should act as if the planet is on fire. And here another
millennials and people and Gen Z and all these folks that come after us are looking up, and we're like, the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. And your biggest issue is your biggest issue is how are we going to pay for it?
So she said this 4 years ago, right? So now she apparently believes that the world will end in 8 years from now if we don't act. Actually, chances are that this year we're going to breach the 1.5 degrees of global warming. So if these forecasts are right, the world will end before Christmas, right? Of 2023. This is not a new sentiment at all. This is a piece from The Guardian, 100 Days to Save the World. And for those of you with good eyesight, note that this was written in 2015. But 2015 was also not the first time.
You should just come over. We had 5 years left to sign. News guy wept when he told us Earth was really dying. 5 years, that's all we got.
That was David Bowie, and as you may have noticed from the clothes he was wearing, this was the early 70s, right? The idea that climate change is an existential threat is widespread. These are results from a survey that was done quite a while ago. Well, not quite a while ago, 4 years ago, 2019. And at the very bottom, it's the belief or people say or express their agreement with the fact that climate change will lead to the extinction of the human race. And you see that there's quite a few people who at least say that they believe this. So this is something that has gotten hold of the collective psyche of people all over the planet, but particularly young people. So what I'm going to do next is review 3 of the assertions. We're all going to drown, we're all going to starve, and we're all going to fry. There's a much longer list of dire predictions about the impacts of climate change, and I won't have time to go through them all, but I'm going to take you through these 3 and see how they actually hold up when scrutinized. I'm going to start with we're all going to drown. And you regularly see pictures like this, obviously aimed at an American audience, where the Statue of Liberty is with her up to her waist in water. You can also find pictures like this. This is the map of northwestern Europe at the moment. And then we can add sea level rise, we can add more sea level rise, and we can add more sea level rise. And what you see is that large parts of Western Europe are simply disappearing, including most of my native country, the Netherlands. What these sort of images don't tell you is what is the time scale and what is the likelihood of this happening. You can see pictures like this. Venice will be the first to go, followed by Los Angeles and Amsterdam and Hamburg and St. Petersburg. South London is under threat. Shanghai, Edinburgh, New Orleans, obviously, New York, London, the whole of London. And then for some reason a whole country pops up, Taiwan. And this is then portrayed as sea level rise is something that is really, really serious. You also in the small insets see how the world map will change. But then if you look at the vertical axis, you see meters of sea level rise, but no timescales. In the maps, you actually do see timescales. And the bottom one is 80 years. The middle one is 800 years, and the top one is 8,000 years. And really, if we are talking about multiple meters of sea level rise, and that's not going to happen in your lifetime. That's not going to happen this century. And it may not even happen in the first half of this millennium, right? So we are talking about stuff that may occur, may affect your great-grandchildren, but not you personally. But nevertheless, you see pictures like this. This is again Manhattan on the water. You see pictures like this. This is actually from the Chinese delegation to the climate negotiations, Stop Climate Change Before It Changes You, suggesting that we will indeed become a species that is used to aquatic living, right? But if you look at what is actually going to happen over this century during your lifetimes, I won't see the year 2100, but many of you guys will, and some may even make it to 2150, right? If you look at the vertical axis here, then projected sea level rise over this period is a meter at most. So that's about here, right? For me. That's water coming up to your waist, perhaps a little bit higher depending on how tall you are. That's the projected sea level rise. And yes, in the longer term, it will get worse than that. But the idea that you guys will face massive sea level rise during your lifetimes is there's simply no physics that will lead to that. It will not happen in this universe. It may happen in a parallel universe where the laws of physics are different, but it cannot happen in this universe, right? So what about the impacts of sea level rise? Well, here we're looking at two satellite images of Hulul Male, which is the island next to the main island of the Maldives. And you see the dramatic impacts, right? These two pictures were taken 20 years from each other. And one picture you see a build-up island, and the other is essentially completely bare. And you may think, well, this is terrible, right? Until you realize that the top picture is the older one, and the bottom picture is the newer one. The Maldives are often taken as a poster child for vulnerability to sea level rise. Maldives are actually a middle-income country, have a great financial sector, great tourism sector. They're actually relatively rich. Also, over the recent decades, have become very good at coastal engineering. And this island is actually weaponized against sea level rise and against typhoons. And the Maldives, even though they like to portray themselves as vulnerable in order to improve their negotiation power internationally and attract more development assistance, not that they need that much nowadays. But actually, if you go visit the country, you see they're actually pretty good at protecting themselves. When the media talks about the perils of sea level rise and storms, you often see pictures like this, a pier being severely battered by waves and winds, but you much more rarely see pictures like this. This is a movable dam to keep the water out during high tide and during storms. This is a fixed dam. We actually don't know who invented coastal protection, who invented dike building. We do know that the Sumerians, more than 5,000 years ago, were pretty good at flood protection and irrigation. We do know that the ancient Chinese independently invented dike building, perhaps a little bit later than the Sumerians. But nowadays we are much, much better at this sort of stuff than they were. They did it without computers, they did it without any sort of mechanized force, right? This dike that you're actually looking at here was built with steam engines, but mostly with wheelbarrows and spades. Nowadays we're much, much better at this. Also, we're much, much better at actually recognizing what is going on with along the coast with satellites. We're much better at modeling with modern computers and so on and so forth. And we've actually, over the last 5,000 years of history of dike building, at the least, have become very, very good at coastal protection. Right? Sea level rise is not something that should keep you up at night. So a second claim that is often made is that we're all gonna starve. And when people talk about climate change, you often see pictures like this, a completely desiccated, what used to be arable land. If you look at what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says about this, a much more nuanced picture emerges. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is sort of a United Nations body that every so often surveys the literature on everything to do with climate change and climate policy. And this is what they say about crop yields. So we're looking at the three main crops. That is maize at the top, wheat in the middle, and rice at the bottom. This is where we get roughly 70% of our calories from. So this is what sustains us. And then at the left, you're looking at what's going on in the temperate regions. And at the right, you're looking at what would go on with climate change on the tropical regions. On the horizontal axis, you're looking at climate change, or an index of the severity of climate change, 1 degree of warming up to 5 degrees of warming. And then on the vertical axis, you're looking at the change in crop yields. So this is essentially how much grain you get from an acre of land. And this is relative change to today. And you see a very mixed picture. The dots are primary studies. The lines is sort of a curve that is drawn through this. With some sort of empirical, some sort of statistical method. And what you see is, as I said, a very mixed picture. Depending on the crop and the location that you're looking at mildly negative in the red or more severely negative. This is one of the most severe. Wheat in the tropics, you can see a decline up to 40% for 5 degrees of warming. So that's by the year 2200 or so. And that is a very substantial drop in crop yields. And the reason for this is very simple, that wheat is a cold-adapted plant, right? It's not something you would want to grow in the tropics in the first place. If you look at what's going to happen to wheat in temperate regions, then you see a decline of up to 10% or so. Now, that is the red lines. The blue are different. And the difference between red and blue is on-farm adaptation. The assumption in the red results is that farmers will continue to do what they have always done. And even if they see their crops fail year after year after year, they will not change cultivar, they will not change irrigation, they will not change the application of fertilizer, they will continue sowing and harvesting at the same time as their grandparents did. And that is the assumption in the red curve. And of course, if circumstances change, you should change your behavior. But this is work that is done by natural scientists who don't trust social science. They don't think that people have agency, and they just make the simplest assumption, and that is that people will stick to whatever they have always done. Just like you guys are doing exactly what your parents did when they were 18 or 19, right? And they also did exactly what their parents did when they were your age, right? So you are just carbon copies of your grandparents. That is essentially the assumption that is made here about farmer behavior in the red results. If you look at the blue results, there the assumption is that there's on-farm adaptation, that farmers actually observe what is going on in their fields. I'm from a farming family, and I can tell you that is what farmers do all the time. They observe what is going on with their crops and actually adjust their behavior, change crops, change sowing dates, change harvesting dates, depending on what they observe is going on their farm. And then when you look at that, then actually a lot of the negative results disappear. The impact of climate change on wheat becomes positive in the temperate regions, still negative in the tropical regions. Rice actually, because rice loves heat, as long as there's enough water, and the world will not only become warmer but also wetter, you actually see rice yields go up if farmers actually respond to what is going on. This is another picture that highlights some of the results. I was talking about up to, say, a 50% reduction in crop yields. And you think, oh, that's scary, right? But that's for 5 degrees of warming, which happens on a time scale of 1 to perhaps 2 centuries. What you're looking at here is the change in crop yields over the last century, or actually 120 years. At the top, you're looking at how yields have changed. And this is mostly technological progress. This is better farm equipment, this is improved seeds, this is better fertilizers, better irrigation. And what you see, and everything is indexed, things are not indexed, this is tons per hectare. What you see is that over the last century or so, crop yields have gone up by a factor 8. So if you think that climate change is going to take away half, and that is actually a pretty extreme assumption over a century or so, but technological progress continues as it has in the past, then we will be growing 8 times more on the land anyway, and if the climate change takes away half, then you still have twice as much to eat, right? And the world population is probably not going to double again. Now in the bottom graphs, you're looking not at the change in yields, but at the growth rate of yields. So this is the second derivative, and that has been coming down over the years. Now, some people say this is because of climate change. Some people say this is because technological progress is getting exhausted and it's becoming harder and harder to improve crops. Other people are saying, well, the world actually has too much food at the moment. The distribution of food is the problem, but not the total availability of food. And the reason that crop yields, or the progress in improving agricultural output is slowing down, is because we're awash with food, and really what farmers are doing is growing better foods rather than more food. Higher quality, better environmental protection, and so on and so forth. And that drives the drop in the growth rate of the improvements. And then there is this other thing that is actually the most important one. What you're looking at here is a map of the yield gap. Now, what is the yield gap? So, in basically every country of the world has an extension service, an agricultural extension service, where the government sponsors research and development in agriculture. And what these people do is they create model farms, and then they sort of like show farmers, teach farmers on how to best grow particular crops. And this is state-of-the-art type of agriculture. So that is the model farm. And then we also have what is actually going on in commercial or subsistence farming. And the difference in yield between the model farm and the average farm is called the yield gap. Now, if you look at Europe, North America, then the colors are green, dark green, which means that the actual farmers are very close to the technological frontier. They're actually doing almost as well as the model farms, 80–90% of what can be achieved with the crops that people are actually growing, in the soils that people are actually using, and in the climate that people actually farm in, right? Now, if you look at Africa in particular, what you see is that the yield gap can be up to 90%. That is, the average farm may get 1 bushel of wheat per acre, whereas the model farm, in the same climate, in the same soil, using existing technologies, not some science fiction type of technologies for agriculture, no, using existing technologies, will get 10 bushel per acre. And the reasons for this have to do with security of tenure, access to improved seeds, access to capital, access to irrigation, and so on and so forth. But the implication of this is, thinking back again to the most pessimistic projection of climate change, that could take away half of crop yields, but bringing people to the technological frontier would actually improve crop yields by a factor of 10. So yes, there are problems with the food supply in large parts of the world, affecting lots of people, but climate here is not the primary signal. Climate is a factor 2, but underdevelopment is a factor 10. Right? So bring these people up to the technological frontier, then impose the worst climate change projections, and they would still be 5 times better off in terms of the food supply. Final thing that people say about the impacts of climate change is we're all going to fry. Climate change is so strong that it can defeat Roger Federer, right? This is a few years ago in the Australian Open. I apologize for putting Ben & Jerry's up here. This is before I knew about their role in Ukraine. This study was published in I think the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States. This is the number of days projected to exceed potentially deadly heat levels by the year 2100. and this looks scary, right? So the dark red essentially, or the deepest red essentially means that 350 out of 356 days a year, the heat would be deadly. This seems scary, right? And fortunately for most of you guys, this is gonna happen far away from where you live or plan to live, right? But still it looks sort of scary. And of course it doesn't matter how many days of deadly heat there are, because most of us, except when your name is James Bond, can die only once, right? So one day is enough of being exposed to something that is fatal. So this seems pretty scary until you start reading the paper in detail, and then what they find is that at the moment already 30% of people are exposed to deadly heat, which would suggest that we are looking at not the sort of death rates that we saw during the height of the COVID pandemic, but we're actually looking at the moment, we're looking at death and destruction at the scale of the Black Plague in the 14th century in Europe, right? Which is obviously not going on. Yes, people are dying, but it's not the case that 30% of the population in Africa is lying dead in the street, right? So their model is simply miscalibrated. They say that 30% of the world population is already dead, which is a bit strange. In the same journal, colleagues published a very similar paper where they said that 11% of the world population is already dead, right? And for some reason, editors and referees look at that paper and don't say, well, this is a very peculiar assumption to make, guys. It's mostly guys who do this. But it is true that the world is getting warmer. It is true that heat waves are dangerous to human health. But what can you do against that? What we're looking at here is, and there's no good recent data on this, this is the sale of air conditioning by country or region in the year 2016. And we sort of have this picture of the southern United States being completely air conditioned. If you go to China, particularly to southern China, what you see is that most of the hotter parts of China are already air conditioned. And also if you travel to Beijing, which is actually not that hot, you see a lot of residential air conditioning. If you go to the richer parts of India, then you also see that most of the upper middle class and increasingly the middle class in India is air conditioned. So even if the outside temperature may be unbearable, we actually don't quite know what is unbearable to the human body. There are these experiments that sort of suggest that 55 degrees of dry heat, is too much for the human body, because then your organs will begin to fail, and that actually goes down to 35 degrees Celsius if humidity is 100%. Then your body will start to give up. But then if you look at the recent experience with pretty severe heat in, say, Pakistan, there was this piece in The Guardian last summer where this journalist was traveling to Jacobabad because projected, or the actual temperatures in Jacobabad were 57 degrees Celsius. And this journalist sort of wrote part of this before the trip apparently, and was expecting to find the bodies piled high in Jacobabad, and was surprised to find people weren't exactly happy, right? You couldn't do much, and this sort of heat is pretty oppressing, but they were all alive. And that is because people change their behavior. Of course, people out there are pretty much accustomed to extreme heat, so they know how to cope with it, and they also very cleverly exploited the microclimates within the city. That means that there's hotter places and cooler places, and people are simply avoiding the hotter places, and we're shifting most of their jobs to the night, right, when it's much cooler. So, yeah, people can cope, and this of course means the spread of air conditioning means that there will be cooler places where you can make it through the heat wave. This is projections of where air conditioning will go. The red is sort of the demand for air conditioning in hotter places, blue is in colder places, and then on the horizontal axis you're looking at projected or actual incomes. And what you see is that as people grow richer, the uptake, and definitely in warmer places, the uptake of air conditioning is going up. And even in Southern Europe, you now see residential air conditioning. And these are projections of the share of households with at least one air conditioner. And this is the same here, and this is then in office buildings. And what you see is you have an immediate solution, an immediate technical solution to excessive heat. So we're not all going to drown, we're not all going to starve, and we're not all going to fry. As I said in the beginning, I can do this for other projected impacts of climate change, other scary stories that you find regularly in the media. When you start probing these things, it is just not true. The typical assumption that people make, the typical mistake that people make, is that humans have no agency, that we will just continue to do the same thing that we have always done, and that you will behave exactly like your grandparents did. It's a very peculiar assumption. And the other assumption that people make is that there's no technological change, that nobody is inventing anything new. I've been in this climate game for 35 years almost. It is older than I think all of you. I'm not wearing my glasses, so I can't see everyone. It used to be that we were terribly scared of the spread of tropical diseases, particularly malaria. And it is of course true that if the world is warmer, mosquitoes will be more active. The parasite will develop faster. It's also true that if the world would be wetter, then mosquitoes have more breeding places, and you would indeed expect an increase in the spread of malaria in a warmer and wetter world. That is beyond doubt. But those who have been paying attention, late last week, the World Health Organization, WHO, approved a malaria vaccine. That 30 years ago, people thought, we don't know whether that will ever be, and definitely there was no working one. This week, or rather since last week, there is a malaria vaccine. Which means that two things. One, we don't need to worry so much about climate change making malaria worse, because if this vaccine will be spread worldwide, then there won't be no malaria. That is a good thing. The other good thing is, of course, that at the moment malaria kills around 500,000 children each year. So having a vaccine for this is actually good, regardless of what climate change will do to this disease, right? But this is a concern that people had for a very long time, and I believe a genuine concern. But technological change has solved this particular problem, right? So, I'm going to continue for another 15 minutes, and then we're going to do the break. It's 20 to 10. So what do we know about the impacts of climate change? I've said most of these things. Is climate change an existential threat? No. There is nothing in the literature that suggests human extinction or even large-scale mortality. That's simply not based on any science. And this is actually, if you just take a step back and see what are humans like, right? You can find humans on the equator and on the poles, almost on the pole. You can find humans living in the rainforest. You can find humans living in the desert, right? We are the ultimate generalist. Humans can live basically anywhere. There's people living in outer space, right? Also, if you look through time, as a species, we actually made it, well, depending on when you put the start of the species, we made it through at least one ice age, but probably 4 ice ages. And actually, we made it through the last ice age before we invented sewing, right? People did not wear clothes because we did not know what a needle and a thread was when we made it through the last ice age. It was just fire and heights, right? That got us through that. We're better than that now technologically. And it's not just that we are very good at adapting to our environment, we're also very good at changing our environment to adapt it to our needs, right? Does not mean that climate change is not a problem. It is. What you're looking at here is the universe of estimates of the impacts of climate change. Climate change is typically seen as a very big problem, but there's only 62 estimates in 40 papers that will tell you what will climate change do to the well-being of the average person, and that is what you're looking at here. On the horizontal axis, you're looking at changes in the global mean surface air temperature since pre-industrial times. This is not because we think that warming is the only thing that matters for climate change. This is not because we think that warming will be uniform across the planet, but this is just an index of the severity of climate change. And if you move from left to right, you see that climate change is getting worse. On the vertical axis, you're looking at the Higgsian equivalent variation, and you haven't had that in your principles. Well, I think actually it will be in micro 1 or 2 that you get the Higgsian equivalent variation. The way to understand this, if we focus on 2.5 degrees of warming, say, for which we have most evidence, then what these numbers means that if the world were to warm by 2.5 degrees, then the average person would feel as if she had lost 1.9% of her income. Does not mean that she has lost 1.9% of her income, but she would feel as if, right? And the way to imagine this is I take away 2% of your monthly income. That would make you pretty cross, right? That is how climate change would make you feel, right? What you see here is actually strong disagreement between experts of what climate change will do to us. Different methods yield different results, different authors come up with different estimates. And you see the enormous uncertainty and the wide disagreement here. You also see some positive impacts, right? And the positive impacts of climate change, which in some cases dominate actually the negative ones, definitely for land warming, are as follows. Warmer winters means that you spend less money on heating your home, and people actually spend a good bit of money on that, so that is a positive. For most parts of the world, cold-related mortality is actually much higher than heat-related mortality. It's not so much that people die of cold exposure. Very few people do, and mostly because they were stupid and drunk and went out without a coat and fell into the water, right? That is what kills you, but very few people do that, right? It's actually what happens is that during the colder months, we spend more time indoors. And if you spend more time indoors, you're closer to other people, typically. And that means that diseases like the flu will spread much more quickly. And that is actually what kills people. But if it gets warmer in winter, we can spend more time outdoors, right? We have this unseasonably warm October. And if you walk around campus, lots of students are doing the smart thing and having their lunch on the grass, right? Rather than sitting in the restaurant. And that, of course, stops the spread of infectious disease, besides just being very pleasant, right? And the third reason that we see initially positive impacts of climate change is because CO2 is plant food. It really is. And that is actually a minor thing, but if there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, then plants also become more water efficient. Because the same process that takes up CO2 out of the atmosphere for photosynthesis and plant growth, that process also transpires water. So if there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, plants transpire less and they need less water to grow. So those are the three main positive impacts of climate change. The one that you see towards the right is a peculiar estimate. And the estimate there is from what I call the Inter-Siberia hypothesis. You all know that historically we come out of Africa. This study runs the impacts of climate change in a model that assumes that there's no barriers to the movement of capital. It's a ropey assumption, but also assumes that there's no barriers to the movement of labor. And what this model does is it puts the world economy and most of the world population in Siberia, where there's plenty of space. By the end of the century, that is where you guys will all live, if this model is to be believed. And then you actually find positive impacts of climate change because we simply move out of harm's way. I'm not quite sure that you guys are ready to move to Omsk or Tomsk or whatever these places are called here. Now this picture is pretty confusing. The gray line is sort of like a best fit through all the estimates that you see, and then you can use that model to project everything to 2.5 degrees of warming, except the estimates that were already on 2.5 degrees of warming. And then you can build a histogram, and that looks something as follows. And what you see is that the bulk of the estimates are somewhere between 0 and 2% negative. That is, and this is 2.5 degrees of warming, that is 60, 80 years of global warming will be about as bad as losing 1 year of economic growth. That is what the literature says. This histogram also emphasizes the uncertainty, and you see there is a wide range, and also the skew in that uncertainty, that is negative surprises are much more likely than positive surprises. Really, the economics literature, the literature that has looked at the impacts of climate change on human welfare, I'm not talking about other species, suggests that climate change will simply not be the biggest problem there is, right? Now, this is for the world average. Which is not particularly interesting. So let's use the same data, the same methods, as well as the regional estimates that are behind the dots and the triangles that you see here, and project things to the countries. On the vertical axis, you're still looking at the Higgshian equivalent variation. On the horizontal axis, you're now looking at per capita income in the year 2015. And essentially you see very clear, you still see the enormous uncertainty about these numbers, right? But you also see a very clear pattern here. That is, the richer countries that are to the right in this graph see fairly minimal impacts of climate change and may even see benefits for 2.5 degrees of warming, whereas poorer countries see much more negative impacts, up to -20 for some countries, right? That's the best guess, and then there's this enormous uncertainty around it. Now, there's one thing that may confuse you, right? because the bulk of the estimates here is negative and fairly negative, but the world as a whole is 2% or so negative. The reason for that is very simple, and that is that the world aggregate counts dollars rather than people. So if the majority of people is negatively affected, but it's mostly poorer people that are negatively affected, then in dollar terms, that doesn't mean a whole lot. And the world economy is dominated by rich people, right? And in this case, you guys are included among the rich, right? Because compared to the world, you're actually fairly well off, even though it doesn't feel like that, right? So that explains. Now, why do we find this pattern? There's three basic reasons for this. One is that poorer countries simply have a greater exposure to weather and climate than richer countries do. You guys probably aspire to work in the financial sector, to work for a bank or something. The majority of you guys, well, you may not aspire to that, but the majority of you guys will end up working there, right? Or you may end up working in publishing or in government or something like that. That is, you will work in an office. An air-conditioned office, probably. In poorer countries, 70% of the workforce is in agriculture. 50% of economic output in the poorest countries is in agriculture. And that means that simply the difference in economic structure means that poorer countries are much more exposed to what is going on with climate and weather than we are in the United Kingdom, right? So the first reason is the structure of the economy. I'm going to change the axis from per capita income in the year 2015 to the average temperature in the country. And what you see here, lo and behold, is that hotter countries, currently hot countries, see much more negative impact, whereas currently cold countries see by and large, the very cold countries see positive impacts. This is no surprise, doesn't need much explanation. Well, maybe it does a little bit. So the biophysical systems on which we rely sort of have their sort of upper temperature limits, and there's simply no species that have evolved to grow, simply no crops that have evolved to grow in even hotter places, because there are no hotter places on the planet, right? So that is one reason. The other reason is that adaptation is crucially important, the way we respond to climate change. Now, if you live in Brighton and you wonder what would the future be like if it's 3 degrees warmer, then what you do is you say, well, how do people in Marseille or in Barcelona cope with the heat, right? Because that is sort of the projected climate for Brighton in 80, maybe 100 years' time. And what you notice is that people have different buildings. Our buildings are designed to keep the heat in. Mediterranean buildings are designed to keep the heat out. What you notice is that people have dinner late, and that is because actually when you digest food, that actually takes a lot of energy and heats up your body. So it's actually an adaptation to heat to have dinner at midnight, as people do in Barcelona. It's not because they're crazy. This is actually a rational response to the prevailing climate. And that is how you would cope with a hotter Brighton in the future. And you may introduce siestas, right? Now, if you live in Singapore and you wonder what will the world be like if it's hotter, you have nowhere to look, because there is hardly any hotter city than Singapore. And that means that those adaptations to a warmer climate will have to be invented from scratch. For the people in Brighton, it's easy to copy the behavior and the technology and the institutions that you see in Barcelona. But for the people in Singapore, they have no role model. And invention is simply always much more difficult than simply copying somebody else's technology and behavior and institutions, right? Now, the reason that this projects onto poor versus rich is because hotter countries tend to be poorer and poorer countries tend to be hotter, right? And then there's this enormous debate over the last 3,000 years whether this is a causal relationship, and we won't go into that, but definitely the correlation is there. The third reason why poorer countries are more vulnerable to climate change than richer countries is because they have low adaptive capacity. So I talked about agricultural extension services, and I talked about coastal protection. And that is actually, and I talked about air conditioning, and that is actually going to protect us from the impacts of climate change. Now, a lot of adaptation is private, but large parts of adaptation are also public. You guys are not going to build a dike around your house. You expect the government to do that for you, right? Similarly, for the healthcare system, that is in public hands often. Similar for agricultural extension, that's a public service, and so on and so forth. So what you need is a government that is capable of delivering large-scale, complicated infrastructure projects. One of the ways of protecting London from sea level rise is to build a new Thames barrier. This is a major infrastructure project, right? Now, we grumble about our government, right, and its incompetence, and I would agree with that, and I would partake in that grumbling, but UK government is capable of delivering this sort of stuff because it is able to raise money through taxation. It is able to hire competent project managers and engineers to actually do this, and it's not all too corrupt, right? There's some corruption going on, but not a whole lot. If you move to places in Africa, the government is not able to raise taxes in the first place. The tax money that they raise mostly disappears into Swiss bank accounts, and then some countries simply have only 3 people with a master's degree, right, in the whole country. So they're simply not able to do this, right? And of course, in some countries, you have the problem that the government just doesn't care, right, what happens to the people. For those reasons, poorer countries are more vulnerable to climate change than are richer countries, because low adaptive capacity is both a symptom of underdevelopment as well as a cause of underdevelopment, right? The immediate policy implication of this is that there's 2 ways to reduce the extreme vulnerability to climate change, right? One is to take away climate change by greenhouse gas emission reduction, and the other is to grow richer, right? So, to wrap up the first hour, the impact of climate change on human welfare seems modest. And the person associated with this is the 2019 winner of the Nobel Prize, Bill Nordhaus, who you see at the top. And this conclusion has been around for 30 years now and seems to be pretty robust. The second conclusion, that the worst impacts of climate change are more symptoms of underdevelopment and mismanagement than anything else. They're symptoms of underdevelopment rather than symptoms of climate change. And this goes back to the 2005 winner of the Nobel Prize. I'm not sure about the 2005, Tom Schelling, who you see at the bottom, and he wrote this up. And that is actually a paper on your reading list in the AER in 1992. So we're going to break for 10, 15 minutes, and then I'm going to talk about why people actually believe in these very negative impacts of climate change. Okay? So I started by showing you all the alarmism that we've seen about climate, well, not all, a selection of the alarmism that we've seen about climate change. And then I poured some cold water on 3 particular issues. We're all going to die, we're all going to drown, we're all going to starve, we're all going to fry. And then I showed you what the economics literature tells you about the impacts of climate change. Which then begs the question, why? Where does this discrepancy between the popular image of climate change and its impacts comes from, and why does it deviate so very strongly from the scientific evidence? And that is what I'm going to spend the next half hour or so on. I'm first going to take away one of the fallacies that you often see, and that is that we need to do something about climate change because it's unprecedented. And that is expressed here by Eric Holthaus, right? It's been, CO2 is over what it was for millions of years before the Ice Age, before modern humans, before the pyramids. What is going on? And that is undisputed. CO2 levels are higher than anywhere in the sort of geological past of the last couple of million years. In the deeper geological past, we see higher CO2 concentrations, but not over the last tens of millions of years. And this goes up to 2016. Of course, CO2 concentrations have increased. Similarly, as I said before the break, chances are that this year we're going to break the 1.5 degree global warming. And we haven't seen temperatures, global temperatures this high for at least 120,000 years, but maybe much longer than that, right? Now, true, climate change is unprecedented. That does not mean that it's bad, right? This is the is-ought fallacy of Hume, or the naturalist fallacy of Moore. For those of you who don't quite know what this is or don't quite like your philosophy, I think Schelling actually said it best. This is different Schelling. This is Friedrich, not Tom. So this is the guy who wrote the words to the Ode to Joy, right? Alle mensen werden Brüder. And he argued that the current climate is optimal because, or the current environment more generally is optimal because it was created by God, and God is not just all-powerful, but also all-good. And therefore, the things that God have given us must be the best things there can be, right? Now, this is a sort of reasoning that I bet doesn't appeal to any of you. But this is an illustration of the is-ought fallacy, right? Just because things used to be like they were, does not mean that we want to keep them that way. And the reason that I say this, we're going to have a different climate in the future. Is that necessarily bad? Well, we don't know. But if you look at past years of schooling, past education, that was pretty bad. And I think most of us would agree that this is better, that more kids are learning how to read and write and do arithmetic, right? Or if you look at democracy, this is an older picture, it's now, this trend is reversing. If you look at the number of people who live in democratic countries or roughly democratic countries, that is increasing. It's unprecedented throughout human history, right? Or human prehistory. We've never been as democratic. Then that is no reason to reverse the trend, the upward trend in democracy, right? I don't have a picture on women's rights, but you would find the same story, right? We don't want to go back to the old days, right? On women's rights, or on democracy, or on education. So that is the first thing I want to take away. But let's return back to the apocalypse, right? This is the MP for, I bet, a whole bunch of you. The apocalypse is happening. This is actually something that you see in the literature. So just 3-4 media clips, right? Fungal diseases because of climate change, starvation because of climate change, war because of climate change, and death because of climate change. Now, those of you who sort of know your Bible, right, these are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And the picture that you see here is Dürer, right? The one at the top is a more modern depiction of the 4 horsemen who are no longer on horse, but on motorbikes and are no longer all men, but there's 2 females there as well. But this is an old story, right? And climate change is often couched in these religious terms. Climate change is often a discourse of fear, right? It is meant to scare you. And it's often couched in religious terms. So emissions are like sin. And then climate change is the apocalypse, Ragnarok, the final reckoning, whatever you call it in whatever culture you're from. And environmentalists then are a bit like priests. They offer a chance of redemption. But also by sort of declaring yourself to be part of this environmentalist tribe, you sort of can express your moral superiority over people who are not so green, right? And of course it creates a tribe, a place for you to belong. And of course, throughout human history, people have been tribal. This is a deep instinct in people that there is a group that we feel we want to belong to. But of course, the tribes of old are gone. Now we support a football club, right? And go beat up the people of the other tribe, right? The other football club. That is one thing we do. But you can also, if you're less so inclined, you can belong to an environmental NGO, right? And then you don't go beat up. Some people do actually. But most environmentalists don't beat up people, but they do have this sense of belonging as well as this sense of moral superiority. And that is something that the environmental movement offers. And then there's of course also the tides that offer income and influence to these environmental NGOs. And the reason that I say this is because we also need to have a look at how science actually works, right? And in the olden days, before the Enlightenment, the church offered 2 things. And this is not just the Christian church or one of the Christian churches, but this is all churches, right? So this also holds for Islam, this also holds for Hinduism, and so on and so forth. The sort of established religion offered 2 things. One, a theory of how the world works, the story of creation and so on and so forth that you find in every religion, but also explanations of why bad things happen to some people and good things to others, right? Every major religion offers a theory on this. So how does the world work? And importantly, the church also offers a theory on how to be good. Right? And those are the 2 major ingredients of every major religion. And then the Enlightenment came along, and what the Enlightenment did was that we're no longer gonna believe things about how the world works because the book says, whatever book people are following. We're no longer gonna rely on the authority of some long dead figure. We're going to actually do experiments, we're actually going to observe, and we're actually going to see how the world really works, right? And essentially what the Enlightenment did was separate the theory of how the world works, if I press this button, what happens, to should I press this button or not, right? How to be good. And the church still offers that second theory, and I'm not saying that you guys should be religious, but you should have a theory, a moral theory of how to behave and how to be a good person, right? That is important, that you have some sort of moral compass. I don't care where it comes from as long as you have one. And it's sort of like rightly calibrated, correctly calibrated. But the Enlightenment separated those two. We now have universities, research labs that figure out how the world works, and then we have moral authorities that tell us how to be good, right? Now, in the early days of the scientific revolution, single smart people could sort of oversee the whole of science because science was pretty small. That is no longer the case, right? There's nobody who understands everything that is going on. Actually, it's quite impossible to understand everything that is going on in economics. It's actually impossible to understand everything that is going on in environmental economics as a single person, let alone that you can also understand the things that are going on in biology and physics, right? We now have disciplines, and that is because knowledge is so vast that you need years and years to specialize to understand what is going on. Now, what does that imply? We have experts in a discipline. But that is not how the public sees it, and that is not how some people would like you to see it. So Scott here says, scientists have landed a spacecraft on a proverbial dime on a planet 40 million miles away. This is Mars. Which is pretty impressive. And then he says, I think I'm going to trust them on climate change as well. No, it's not climate scientists who landed a spacecraft on Mars, right? It was people from a completely different discipline who did that. Neil deGrasse Tyson, who you may have come across, very similar sentiment. We landed on Mars. Why don't you believe us on climate change? Neil, you did not land on Mars. Other people did. And the people who forecast the impacts of climate change or climate change itself are completely different from the engineers of NASA who did this, right? Same deGrasse Tyson. We produced the first ever image of a supermassive black hole. It is indeed, this is very, very difficult to do. This is a major step forward. We've concluded that humans are catastrophically warming Earth. It's different people who do this, right? Politicians of all stripes often phrase climate policy as a scientific imperative. And here we have Guterres again, climate action is urgent, the science demands it. And Yasemin here says the same thing. I'm 100% in for bold and unprecedented action on climate change because that's what the science demands. Science doesn't demand. Oh, here we have Caroline Lucas saying the same thing. Eric Holthaus again, The Guardian, 154 experts. And Greta also chimes in. Unite behind the science. This is not what science says. This kitten here agrees with those sentiments. But this is not what science does, right? If you're on the beach and you see the water retreating fast, then science tells you chances are there is a tsunami coming. This is an early warning sign of a tsunami. Science will also tell you that if you run for the hills, you increase your chance of survival. Right? Those two things are scientific facts. Science doesn't tell you to run for the hills. It's your survival instinct that makes you run for the hill, right? Now, science will also tell you that the survival instinct in most people is pretty strong. So I think we can correctly predict that most people would run for the hills. But that is not because science told them to, right? That is something that your value system tells you to. And of course, you guys are in an age group that you know, well, survival instinct isn't strong in everybody, right? But the separation here is between the facts and the values, right? What happens if I press this button is the question that science answers. The question, should I press this button, is not the question that science answers, right? That's your value system that says, yeah, this is a good idea. Now, the reason that politicians and other people do this, they sort of say the science demands this, is because essentially it absolves them from expressing their preferences. They're hiding behind others. They say, this is not my decision. You can't criticize me. I'm just following expert advice, right? Now, Sartre would call this bad faith, right? And if you look at it closely, that is indeed, this is just politicians lying to you. Now, returning to the story I was telling about the church and everything, since the separation between sort of the world, the theory of how the world works and the theory of how to be good, facts and morals nowadays derive from different authorities. Right? And it's important to keep that in mind. Many people find it confusing. They just want to have one authority figure to follow. That's much easier. And therefore attach moral authority to science. Don't do that, right? Ever. And then, of course, there's also academics who actually quite enjoy being able to play dictator, right? And there are some people who argue just because we are smarter than most, and I'm a professor, so I will definitely tell you, yes, I am smarter than most. That does not make us wiser or kinder or anything, right? And you guys have never observed a department meeting at a university. We are not, we may be smarter, but we're not better, and we're definitely not wiser than your average person, right? So that is an important distinction to make. Now, to continue this story, why is climate change cast in biblical terms? Reason for that is very simple. If you're trying to sell something, then you couch your story in an old story, because the old stories are the best. That is actually not true. What is the case is that good stories get old, right? And bad stories die quickly and everybody forgets them, and that is why we think that old stories are the best. Now, if you want to bring an unfamiliar message to somebody, then use the metaphors that are in their heads, right? And therefore, if you want to sell your environmental NGO, what you're going to do, is an old marketing trick, you cast your new message in the old narrative. And that is why you see so many religious overtones in environmentalism. And that is also why environmentalism is so much stronger in Europe than in North America. Because in North America, people are still much more religious than we are in Europe. And therefore, they don't have a need of this new Gaia religion. Whereas in Europe, there is this sort of vacuum. And people are, if you look across the world and across time, people are a religious sort of species. And the fact that we kicked out, in your case, mostly the Anglican Church from your lives, does not mean that there is no demand for religion, right? We just don't want to call it Anglicanism or, in my case, Catholicism or whatever faith your parents adhere to. We just don't call it that way anymore. But there's still this demand for having a religious and moral authority in your lives, right? And the environmental movement has essentially cast themselves in that role, and they essentially cast their message in this old narrative. So that is where the environmental movement comes in. If you look at what is, and part of that is also that they would like to get donations. If you look at what is going on in the media, well, journalists hate me for saying this, but the prime reason, the first thing that a journalist wants to do is sell newspapers or sell clicks, right? That is their most important objective. Journalists will tell you that they're out there to tell the truth, and many of them would hope to do that, but the most important thing is to just earn a living, right? And a story that sort of gets very nuanced and tells you the pros and cons and gets very lengthy and very complicated fast, that is not going to sell, right? What sells is a spectacular headline. The worst storm of the last 1,000 years. We're all going to die, right? That is what attracts eyeballs. So journalists simply do not have the incentive to tell you the whole story. There's few journalists who go and lie outright. Those are a few. Many journalists are sort of honest, but very selective in what part of the message that they show. And then, of course, you have the journalist who writes the story. But then the people who write the headlines, the sub-editors, actually are different people. And the role of a sub-editor is to attract attention, right? So journalist writes a sort of nuanced story. The sub-editor picks the most dramatic line out of the story and puts that in the headline, right? So that is why you see such sensationalist cover of basically everything. One thing that I just don't understand is, with the role of the media, is that they can't tell a nuanced story about environmental issues. And what they tell you always is that people is beyond people's comprehension and beyond people's ability to follow a complicated story. But then if you look at the coverage of the Rugby World Cup, right? Those are very long stories, right? Very complicated, and rugby is an extremely complicated game, and people are just watching that. And they're obviously capable of absorbing the complications of rugby, or in your case, cricket, which I really don't understand. People are able to absorb that. If you talk to the average American, they can just, from the top of their head, give you all the baseball statistics. But they can't do the same thing with the environment. It's simply not in people's interest to get complicated stories about this. But people are obviously able of following very complicated stories about soccer or rugby or cricket, right? Politicians are sort of in the same mode as environmentalists and journalists, right? They like to grab attention, they're looking for donations, they're looking for support. And of course, one thing that politicians also do is they're looking for a legacy. And what better legacy than to have saved the world, right? Of course, then what you first need to do is convince your voters that the world is under threat, right? And that only you can save them. Now, I used to call this the Bruce Willis syndrome until people pointed out, yeah, I'm favoring white guys, right? Will Smith, of course, is also known for having saved the world multiple times, as has Angelina Jolie, right? So pick your favorite world-saving superhero and say, well, that is who I aspire to be, right? So that is what politicians like to do. And really what we want is, I mean, climate policy is actually very simple. If you look at the textbook, and you will have the opportunity to do so in year 3, then what we want for climate policy is a carbon tax, a uniform carbon tax, and nothing but a carbon tax. That is the textbook solution to climate change. And you can do that with a team of 4 or 5 people in the Treasury. We don't know how many civil servants work on climate policy. There have been estimates, guesstimates, there have been freedom of information requests, and nobody really understands or nobody really knows how many civil servants are working on climate policy. But it's probably in the UK measured in the thousands, if not tens of thousands. And again, that is where the bureaucratic incentive lies, right? If you go back to the theory of how bureaucratic organizations work, Niskanen and others, then the incentive of a civil servant is to, or of a bureaucrat, is to maximize his or her desk size. To have as many people working for you, to have as large a budget as possible. And the way you do that is by creating complicated rules, right? And even when the textbook will tell you there is a simple solution, a carbon tax, the bureaucrat will have a selfish reason to reject this advice and go for a complicated design system where you need to hire lawyers to write the rules, and then you need to hire people to monitor what is going on, and so on and so forth. And you need to hire consultants to write long reports about how this is going to work and what are its pitfalls, and perhaps there's alternatives, and so on and so forth, right? So it's in the interest of the civil service to make climate policy as complicated as possible. And that is indeed what we have seen happen over the last 30 years or so. And then there's other people who sort of jump on this. And this is, again, perfectly rational. If you're a campaigner against racism, you should be. If you're a campaigner against sexism, or a campaigner for human rights, and so for those of you who didn't hear, the question is, don't we have a carbon tax already? And the answer is yes. So the textbook prescription is a carbon tax, a uniform carbon tax, and nothing but a carbon tax, right? So what we have in the UK and in some other countries is a carbon tax that covers some greenhouse gas emissions, but definitely not all, right? Yes. Can I finish? So we have a partial carbon tax rather than a full carbon tax. We have a carbon tax that is differentiated between sectors, between users, between large users and small users, between users that seek favor with the government and users that ignore the government. So we definitely do not have a uniform carbon tax. But most importantly, and this is all the UK, most importantly, we have a whole bunch of other regulations for greenhouse gas emission reduction as well. And actually, if you look at the sectors that are covered by the carbon tax, they are also covered by an emissions trading system, so that is double regulation. They're covered by subsidies for renewables, that is triple regulation, as well as mandates for energy efficiency, quadruple regulation, and mandates for renewable penetration. So we have quintuple regulation in the electricity sector for climate, right? No, I didn't have time to do this, sorry for that. There is a carbon tax in the UK, but it's definitely not the textbook prescription of a carbon tax. So, if you are a do-gooder for some cause, then you are very jealous of climate change, right? Because that attracts all the attention, much more than other good causes. So what are you going to do? Well, you can jump up and down and you say, well, women's rights are important too. Or you could say, climate change is sexist, right? And then you attract the climate change crowd immediately, and that is what makes you more influential. Or you could say climate change is racist, right? Or if you're an anti-capitalist sort of person, you can say, well, the root cause of climate change is capitalism, and the solution, therefore, is to abolish capitalism, right? And Naomi Klein, is perhaps the most prominent figure who does this, but she is certainly not alone, right? And this creates a backlash, right? So if you sort of like go into the media and you phrase climate as a scientific imperative, and somebody does that, then if you don't like that message, then you can explain that this is Hume's is-ought fallacy, right? Or Moore's naturalistic fallacy. But if you have 10 seconds on TV or 30 seconds on TikTok, then you've lost your audience, right? Because you can't do it. Similarly, if you sort of like tie climate with racism or sexism or other bad things that are going on, then for the people who sort of like do like their sexism, you can of course explain that no, climate is not really a sexist issue. There's no real reason to assume that climate policy or climate change really affects men and women differently. You can explain that, but then you've lost your audience, right? Another thing that is happening with climate policy, and I've explained that, is that it creates an ever larger state and ever more regulation. So people who are in favor of a smaller state have reasons to dislike climate policy. And because climate is a global problem, what we have seen is that climate is a transfer of sovereignty of the states to the federal government in the United States. It's a transfer of sovereignty from the member states of the EU to Brussels. And actually this was a small part of the Brexit campaign as well, that we don't want Brussels to rule our energy system, right? Now you can explain to people, we can do climate policy without a transfer of sovereignty, or we can do climate policy without creating a larger state. But that is difficult, right? It is much easier to say, definitely if you have 10 seconds on primetime TV, to say that climate change is a hoax, because that is something you can say in 10 seconds, or climate scientists are all crooks, or things like that, right? That is a much easier message to bring across. And that explains why there are some people who genuinely believe that climate change is not well founded, that it's not a sound theory, that the empirical evidence is all rotten. That's a very small group of people who believe that. A much larger group of people are in this for selfish interest. That, yeah, this is their way of attracting attention. And of course, climate science, as every science, is far from perfect. So there are pieces of weakness in the evidence that you can point to. but they don't take away the overall message. Yeah, climate change is real, climate is really changing, it is really caused by humans, and it really is a problem. Those things are extremely solid. There's sort of like 0.1% of papers that you can see, well, that paper isn't right, does not overturn this conclusion at all. But this explains also why there is such a fairly large group of people who say that climate change isn't real or it's all a hoax. And now that used to be particularly strong in the United States. It is actually growing in Europe as well. Now in Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland is riding high in the polls, and they are just outright deniers of climate science, right, of climate change. But also we see, well, UKIP often has long had this sort of beliefs, but UKIP of now have penetrated the Tory party quite strongly, and judging by his latest behavior, it seems that the Prime Minister doesn't appreciate climate change or climate policy either, right? So this is one of the unfortunate implications of some of the things that I told you, right? That we now see this polarization and actually a debate over facts where there should not be a debate. 3 minutes left. What I've said over the last 2 hours is climate change is not a threat, but it is a problem that should be solved. But unfortunately, it is in a lot of actors' self-interest to exaggerate what is really going on. This leads to polarization and also to make false promises that cannot be met and may lead to a backlash. That's all I wanted to say, except for one thing. So we have a session on Thursday that's going to be online. There is a video that needs to be watched before you come, and then we have a quiz sort of as a practice for the exam in week 4, right? So please watch the video, and you may want to look at the questions as well of the quiz. And then I hope to see you guys on Thursday online.